It is my pleasure, everyone, to introduce Elizabeth Yampierre and welcome her to ACSP. She's a well-known Puerto Rican civil rights attorney and an environmental activist. Elizabeth, we're so honored to have you here as a keynote speaker for our focal event on planning for climate justice. Elizabeth is no stranger to folks in New York, in New Jersey, and around the world. She heads up UPROS, Brooklyn's oldest Latino community-based organization. UPROS itself was founded in 1966 and has been at the forefront of many environmental justice actions over the years. Elizabeth has been active in UPROS for over 20 years. As its executive director, Elizabeth leads the organization and champions many campaigns, collectively working to advocate for climate justice in Brooklyn's Sunset Park neighborhood. As a member of progressive coalitions and alliances, such as the New York Environmental Justice Alliance and the Climate Justice Alliance, UPROS has taken on climate advocacy for poor people and people of color in the region. Elizabeth, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your comments. Colleagues, as we're getting started, this is the format we've worked out. Elizabeth is going to have the floor for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience. I will be moderating the Q&A, so as you post your questions, I'll be raising them to Elizabeth and having her speak. Marlon will be monitoring the chat space, but if you have questions for Elizabeth, I recommend you put them in the Q&A. Thank you, and I'm going to mute now.
Lakshmi, thank you so much. That was an adventure. I was thrown off. I've never had that happen, but here we are having this important conversation today at this moment, at this historical and political moment where all of us need to center ourselves on racial justice and equity and its intersection with climate change. And so thank you so much for welcoming me and giving me an opportunity to share with you where those of us who are part of the leadership of the climate justice movement, what we're thinking about, what we're concerned about in the direction that we're heading. I want to start by saying to everyone, Ashe, and thank you. This is my first week actually giving talks after losing my mom a few weeks ago. And I want to say a little bit about her as I open, because our family, the history of my family is a story about environmental justice. Our family was displaced from an agricultural town where the land was taken over by U.S. petrochemical industries and forced to move to the city to find manufacturing work, where my mom and her siblings played in an open sewer in Puerto Rico's worst slum. Half her siblings, 6 of them, died from hunger and disease before she came to the United States at the age of 4 to live, work, and raise a family in communities surrounded by brownfields, lead paint, waste transfer stations, power plants, and the everyday violence hoisted on us by systemic racism. So our story, ours is the story of extraction of our land, of our labor, of our lives. And those of us who come from the climate justice movement know that it's this ancestral knowledge that my mom held, that my family has held, that all of us hold, that's necessary to drive solutions and move us towards a just transition. And, you know, if anyone has read The Parable of the Sower, they know that Octavia Butler was really prescient when she wrote that book. She was really predicting the future, which is right in front of us. But in an earlier book called Wild Seed, which I would encourage everybody to read, she writes, habits were difficult to break: the habit of living, the habit of fear, even the habit of love. So how do we talk about where we are heading without seeing where we are, how we got here, and engaging in a commitment to break those habits that have contributed to where we are today? So like climate change and the conditions of our communities are the consequence of a long history of extraction. We share legacies of fighting colonialism as well as race, class, and gender oppression while advocating for environmental and climate justice. We are the descendants of enslavement, colonialism, and extraction. Our communities are the first and most impacted by the storms, fires, floods, and droughts, and are disproportionately burdened by the pollution, poverty, and systemic violence associated with white supremacy, capitalism, and the multinational corporations driving these ecological crises. This is not a future problem. This is happening right now. All you have to do is remember Katrina, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Ida, Andrew, Irma, all devastating frontline communities. How do we build and engage in a just recovery while dismantling this systemic racism so that we don't recreate the conditions that have always existed and just add a green patina? You all know, and you all know this, that's the reason why we're having this conversation, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that life on Earth can recover from a drastic climate shift by evolving into new species and creating new ecosystems, but humans cannot. And while we have been wringing our hands thinking of solutions, there are those creating a never-ending number of organizations, alliances, and coalitions, all tripping over each other to run to the front to save humankind, and many are tripping and rolling over Black, Indigenous, people of color, leading on climate justice because that's the habit, without stopping to assess what is needed, how to support, or do some landscaping necessary to assess where are the gaps. Like many before them, they engage in an active extraction, and it prevents us from building momentum, from building a groundswell, from being strategic and being resourceful with our power and our resources. All this is the culture of practice. This is the habit while we are addressing climate change. So what is climate justice? The definition is tremendously important. And there's this tendency in the United States for individuals to think that they can redefine things, that they have the power to do that, and to dishonor the collective that has come together to create frameworks and an analysis and language that really tells the narrative of how frontline communities are impacted by climate change. And when they redefine the language, what they do is they redefine us out of the definition. So for example, when you hear about environmental justice, you hear that the definition is the disparate siting of environmental burdens in low-income communities and communities of color. What you don't hear is that for it to be environmental justice, it has to be led by the people most impacted. And that's true about climate justice as well. Without the front line, it isn't climate justice. Climate justice operates at the intersection of racial and social rights, environmental and economic justice. It focuses on root causes of climate change and calls for a transformation to a just, sustainable community-led economy. Like resource rights, climate justice also means that those most impacted offer the most effective solutions. And for our frontline communities, the solutions start with defending land and rivers from mines, power plants, mega projects, and industrial agriculture, and expanding agroecology, transformative economies, and building community-controlled energy and food systems. It also means that if the frontline doesn't lead it, it's not climate justice. And we've seen in recent months, we've seen the heat waves across the Pacific Northwest, warnings for earlier hurricane season, and the continued fight for clean air, water, and food as a right and not a privilege as enjoyed by those who can afford it. We know we are in a moment of deep reckoning. So consequently, movement building, which is one of the things that I hope that you all really care deeply about, movement building must reflect the moment we are in. And this is a time when the spirit of competition and the history and legacy of competition has to be thrown away, and we need to be thinking deeply about how we build just relationships and engage in deep collaboration. The jockeying for power and resources will kill us. The competition, instead of collaborating, really is a mirror of old practices that we need to break. When the Climate Justice Alliance, which I co-chair, was formed in 2013, it was to create a new center of gravity in the climate movement. And it was also due to the recognition that there was a need to strengthen democratic representation of frontline community leadership at the national climate movement tables, as well as international spaces such as the United Nations climate change conferences. We cannot afford to build a culture of practice that reflects old habits, the habits of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, wrong. Any climate effort that engages in this way is not climate justice. And different regions have different needs. Identifying those needs can only happen at the local level. This is why the process must be community driven. And for those of you that are planners that are involved in land use, design, zoning, sustainability alone, all by itself, is not justice. It has to be centered in that. So what is your role in this moment as students, as professors, as practitioners? We have, for example, at Uprose built a climate justice center. The Climate Justice Center has a number of initiatives that it has launched, from community-owned solar cooperatives to making sure that we were able to get an investment of $200 million from NYSERDA, which is the state energy agency for New York State, to operationalize offshore wind, the first most aggressive initiative like that in the entire country. That came from the work that we have done closely with planning students who were able to get their marching orders from us, who we were able to say, hey, this is what the community is telling us is a priority. And we need visionaries. We need people who have tools, that are studying different methodologies, are able to create different graphics, maybe create infographics and create different pieces that are necessary so that we can start changing the landscape. We need someone who's going to review every single piece of legislation to tell us, where do we need to pass legislation so that we could get the funding for it? What is the design? What is the engineering involved in this? Those are the roles that planning students played in making it possible for Uprose to have the impact that it has had on the region. They didn't lead. They didn't tell us what the priorities were. They were informed, and they were literally asked to support the vision that was being led by the community. The community was looking at the industrial waterfront. The industrial sector has been responsible for polluting, for contaminating, for giving us asthma, upper respiratory disease, all kinds of health disparities, including COVID. And repurposing it, envisioning a green reindustrialization that makes it possible for the industrial sector to now be the vehicle for green jobs, for climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, the vehicle that will engage our part of Brooklyn in food sovereignty, because we know from Superstorm Sandy that when that storm came down, it missed the Hunts Point food hub by just minutes, and New York City would have been out of food. And so food sovereignty is important. And so often when people think about climate change, they focus on renewable energy, but we also need to think about all the different things that people need in our community: access to clean water, access to food, and access to energy. And it can be done by creating a number of initiatives that connect people with each other so we can strengthen social cohesion. That's where the block-to-block organizing becomes an opportunity. Maybe one block painting its rooftops white, or maybe the community coming together to build an anaerobic digester together. So all of these ideas, from the on-the-block transformation to community-wide efforts like community-owned solar, to passing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the most aggressive climate legislation in the country, which came out of New York, and we were part of the creation of New York Renews to make that happen. All of those pieces work together to take a community and address all of the needs that a community has while it is preparing to address climate change. Remember that the communities that we're talking about are the communities that through COVID lost their homes, lost employment, died in big numbers. I lost 4 people in my family in 2 weeks. We were the communities that were hardest hit, also the ones hardest hit by extreme weather events. So add to everything that our communities have been dealing as the people who are part of the legacy of extraction and are dealing with everything from extreme policing to ICE raids, then add climate change, and you're talking about a level of vulnerability that is incomprehensible. So planning students can play a tremendous role in helping shape and helping create the kinds of systems that make it possible for communities like ours to address really complex problems. And I would invite you to be part of those conversations and to be part of that transformation. There's a different way that it happens here in Sunset Park, and I could give you two different examples. In Red Hook, a neighboring community, planners come in with a vision and present it to the community. They've already cooked it, they've created it, and they engage the most privileged in a gentrified community, while the most impacted become passive in the decision-making process and just give it its amen. Here in Sunset Park, it's a little different. Here we're saying women of color lead. We have solutions. We have a vision that comes from years of meaningful and deep community engagement. And this is what we need you to do for us. This is how you're going to serve a local community vision. Our communities have been involved in research and participatory research, and they have done everything from mapped where all the contaminants are in the waterfront to where the highest levels of NOx and SOx are. So we have our own community scientists, our own people who understand where trucks line up and idle. There is brilliance in the community, and that has to be honored. So what we ask planners to do is something different than what they do in Red Hook. We don't ask you to come with your vision. We ask you to come to support ours. And that, I think, can be really exciting because it actually opens the possibility for an enormous amount of creativity and the kind of decision-making that is going to be necessary because climate change is also going to disrupt governance. What that means is that traditional systems of governance where a few number of people decide what is best for everyone, that is not going to be able to be sustained given what climate change, what we think is going to be created as a result of climate change. We need leaderful, intergenerational communities that are working with each other across the table. And that's radically different than the conventional approach of one leader speaking for everyone, having an office where everyone on the staff knows everything. In the model that we present as a part of a climate justice solution, we literally need to be leaderful and intergenerational, and that's where the brilliance lays. We've done an enormous amount of work and are doing it on everything from what does a carbon neutral supply chain look like, and what does workforce development look like in the face of climate change, and how do we move away from those conventional models if we're trying to develop the kind of workforce that is ready to build for offshore wind. We look at things like offshore wind and ask, what are the climate solutions, environmental justice problems? If we're bringing in the parts to be assembled here at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal from Europe, shouldn't we be building it here? Shouldn't we be passing legislation to build it here? And are these ships that are coming from Europe operating on diesel and parking themselves in EJ communities and dropping tons of emissions on us? Shouldn't they be electric? Well, that leads to another conversation about how we need to electrify the waterfront, right? So one thing leads to another, and all of those things are disciplines that people study in silos. The climate justice community doesn't have the luxury to do that. We have to know a little bit about everything and bring in the experts that provide us with support and technical assistance and make it possible for us to manifest a local vision. What are the threats that we have in front of us? That was a question that I was asked. We have a lot of threats. We have the Biden administration right now being yelled at by the environmental justice and climate justice leadership. We know that Indigenous, Black, Brown, poor Asian, and poor white folks are the primary reason this administration exists. And the main reason the Senate is 50-50 after amazing grassroots organizing in Georgia led to the elections of the state's first Black and Jewish senators. And during the primary season, Biden's campaign was floundering, right? And we were able to bring that back. We call it a colored people resuscitation, our form of political CPR. We have to be cute about these things, right? Because some of it is so hard and painful. And during his victory speech in Delaware on November 2020, President-elect Biden proclaimed, Black people have always had my back and I'll have yours. So far, he has not lived up to his promise, with the exception of a few cabinet administrative appointments. And climate justice is impossible without a robust and functioning democracy where no one's vote is curtailed or threatened. There have been over 250 voter suppression laws in over 40 states. That's 80% of the states in this country that are designed to prevent the coalition that got Biden into office from voting in subsequent elections. So far, the administration's response has been anemic at best, and so has the climate communities. And the truth is that without protecting voting, that the need to protect voting rights is also a function of climate action. So the next decisions of this administration will determine whether 2022 will result in a torrent of Indigenous, Black, Brown, and Asian torpidity or enthusiasm. The former scenario saves the administration, the latter engenders comparisons to Jimmy Carter and his one-term presidency. We believe from the climate justice movement that being the anti-Trump is not enough, that we need a president who is also anti-racist, anti-climate catastrophe, and anti-xenophobia. All of these are interlinked and fostered by the same root causes as the climate crisis. And what we've seen in the appointments is tokenization and marginalization. You've got Deb Haaland, who's the head of the Department of the Interior, and Michael Reagan, who were confirmed by People's Senate and have less visibility and less say in the administration's climate justice initiative than Gina McCarthy, who's supporting what we consider false solutions. And so we are concerned about that because these false solutions are a real problem. And we have been very aggressive about letting the administration know. The administration is talking about Justice 40, and at the same time, and by the way, Justice 40 is fashioned by the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act initiative in the state of New York. But at the same time that the administration is offering these investments and these benefits, they're also tripling down on false solutions: carbon capture sequestration, hydrogen, geoengineering. It's an all of the above strategy to addressing the climate crisis against the recommendations of their own White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the frontline communities across the nation, including Indigenous nations. And we know, and we can talk specifically about how these proven systems not only hurt the environment, but turn frontline communities into sacrifice zones. So that's the future right there. We've got a group of people in the climate movement at odds with each other, where there's tension because their culture of practice is competitive and extractive. And then we've got an administration that is packed with neoliberals who wants to move slowly when climate is rushing through our communities and burning down parts of California every single day. So even with Justice 40, and I'm sure that most of you have been learning about Justice 40, when we talk about Justice 40, we say Justice 40 must not become the new 40 acres and a mule. This time, the communities who are responsible for this presidency expect results and a return on investment for steadfast electoral loyalty and well-deserved reparations. And Justice 40, as I mentioned before, is informed by the CLCPA. So here we are attempting to address the biggest threat to our existence while fighting each other and compromising justice. The question we're left with is, how do you break away from a lifetime of habits that prevent us from building the just relationships necessary to win, because we have to win. And I think that the work that we've been doing has been about building alignment, using the precautionary principle, saying first, do no harm. And how do we create different economies of scale? How do we do that locally? Remembering that there's no cookie cutter approach. The results and the needs of a coastal working waterfront community like Sunset Park in Brooklyn are not the same as you would find in Appalachia, where there's mountaintop removal. It's not the same as it looks in the Gulf South. It's not the same as you find in Indian country. And so honoring and respecting the front line and local solutions is really important. We have big visions. We know what's necessary. We've been passing legislation to make sure that it is funded. And we need people who are going to work with us and ask us, what do you need? How can we serve? And how can we build a movement that not only operationalizes a just transition, but also is leaderful, intergenerational, and is working with each other in a way that is profoundly different than those who have come before us. We can no longer be part of a patriarchal society where decisions are top down. And in fact, we are finding that a lot of the legislation that you see on a national level has been shaped and informed by people on the ground. That is radically different than the past, when grass tops organizations decided for us what was in our best interest. There's something wrong with people who seem to think that they know more than the people on the ground who are living it, breathing it, and surviving it. It says something about core values and about how you use your privilege or don't use your privilege. This is a moment where it's literally all hands on deck. So I welcome you to be part of the work that we're doing. The Climate Justice Alliance has over 70 groups from Puerto Rico all the way to Guam. And the solutions look different depending on where you are. What we agree on is frameworks, everything from energy democracy to a just recovery. And that information is all available to you. And I would love for all of you to use it, not to appropriate it, not to extract it, and not to redefine it, but to use it in a way that elevates, supports, and amplifies the work that is being done on the ground. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to all of your questions. I'm just really honored to be here in this space with you.
Lakshmi, you're muted.
I know that the webinar format doesn't allow for folks to show support in the traditional way, but I encourage you to please put your congratulations and appreciation in the chat. We can open it up for questions, either in the Q&A or in the chat. And so while folks are formulating their questions, Elizabeth, thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks. And I want to pick up where, on some of the points you raised, right? So, and you already alluded to this, but can you speak a little bit about the challenges that you anticipate in the coming months, the campaigns that you're working on, and how we all as planners and planner educators can be supportive of these movements?
Well, thank you for that question, Lakshmi. To be honest, a lot of what we've done, our organization hires planners, and I almost feel like it is the one discipline where people, that sort of flies under the radar. People talk about scientists and engineers and people who are experts in finance and how do we fund a community-owned solar initiatives. But nobody really talks about planners. And the truth is that whether it's zoning decisions, like when we fought Industry City in Sunset Park, their rezoning application because they wanted to take the industrial waterfront and repurpose it and make it a destination location for the privileged. And we were saying that it was a lost opportunity, that we really needed to start looking at how this sector that had harmed communities could be sort of the vehicle for addressing regional climate needs. So planners can play a really important role, everything from mapping to figuring out assets to coming up with, I'm always blown away. And if I get away from myself and don't answer my question, just bring me back. I get lost in my head, please. I'm always amazed by how young people, seriously like young, coming straight out of planning school, are coming out with these tools and this analysis and this and even ways of thinking about how you collect data that literally helps us transform the landscape and the conversation. And so I don't know that we would have been as successful as we've been, at least at my organization, if it wasn't because of the planners and that fight against Industry City. We had a group of about 10 planners that what we asked them to do was to poke holes into the rezoning application by finding what does the supply chain look like, what do you do in a mixed use zone? What happens when there's a right, they have the right to the property? How do we slow that down? They were really what I thought was it was going to be we were going to end up in litigation. And it was the planners that were just sort of like, there were times I was in meetings last week where I had no idea what they were talking about. And I thought, that just sounds brilliant right there. Let's just do that. And you have to trust the team that you work with, because if people are coming with faith and love and brilliance, you have to support it. So yeah, they've transformed. And again, I don't know if I've answered your question. So just bring me back. It's just, I just want to, I know that things are really hard in the direction that we're coming. We're going to have a new mayor in the city of New York that has no history of working with community leadership, who has no history with working on climate justice and really doesn't understand climate justice. He understands mainstream big green organizations that make big decisions that impact everyone, but doesn't know really how sophisticated and complex the work that we hold is. And that's going to be problematic. At the state level, Justice 40, or what's called Justice 40, there's a lot of conversation about benefits when what we're looking for is investments in infrastructure. We're not looking for benefits because benefits can go to anybody and they can be used for anything. But what we're looking for right now is investments. And so that's a challenge. And we're hoping that the state of New York will step deep into it and focus on measuring the metrics of investments and how that's going to land. We also want to make sure that there's what happens when there's funding available, all of a sudden there's a lot of competition, and we can't be that way. We can't have people just chasing the dollars. We're going to have to be strategic, and we're going to have to identify projects that model initiatives that can be replicated. That people can learn, and they have to be different kinds of things, right? Everything from what happens in rural communities to what happens in coastal communities to address needs that are going to be necessary to ensure social cohesion. So that's challenging. Even the definition of what a disadvantaged community is something that we who are making the recommendations to the New York State Climate Action Council is something that we're discussing. What is a disadvantaged community? For example, often in the face of climate change, right? People will say that those are the people who are living in the midst of environmental burdens. But if you're Black, chances are that you were somebody who are going to be disparately impacted regardless of income and regardless of proximity to an environmental burden. And so those are things that we're exploring, and those are challenges both on the local, citywide, state, and federal level. We're trying to change not only the language, but the process. And then finally, I would say that there is no good history of interagency collaboration. And so agencies often work in silos. And what we learned is that that can't happen. You can't have the Department of Health not being in communication with the Department of Environmental Conservation. And then on the national level, you cannot have the Department of Energy not being in communication with the Department of Labor or the Council, the White House Council on Environmental Quality. The allocation of resources can't come through just one agency. The process of accessing those resources for frontline communities has to be streamlined. And there has to be real transparency, and there has to be measuring of how those impacts are landing in our communities. So there's a lot, but the good news is that there's a lot of us. And a lot of us really working well together.
Right. Thank you, Elizabeth. The questions are coming in fast and furious, so I'm just going to get to the audience questions. So this one's very contained, so I'll start with that. Can you provide a couple of examples of things we should teach our planning students to make them more effective at grassroots engagement? Right, like very something specific.
So I think that I don't think planning students engage grassroots groups. I think grassroots groups engage planning students. And what that means is that the folks on the ground are real clear about what their objectives are, what their direction is, what the vision is. And what planning students could do is either provide information on where maybe that is not possible. Maybe it's just zoning, or maybe it's just some land use reg that prevents you from moving forward. So they could identify what the gaps, what the opportunities are, and they can also provide some information on what's happening in different parts of the world what people are doing, which is transformational, and what could work in the area, in the sector that you're working in, right? So there's a lot of information that people in the community don't always have access to, but what they do know is what they need and what the vision is. I think that often people go to school with this idea, I want to go and I want to help save the community. We don't need saviors. We don't need contemporary missionaries. We need partners. We need allies. We need people who have skills and expertise that can make it possible for us to be able to operationalize a big vision like we've done in Sunset Park. And so this idea of like, I'm going to go and do this, I'm going to study to do that. Sadly, it's not acceptable if what you're doing is you're trying to build different kinds of relationships. This is also a society where we are conditioned to celebrity culture, to shine, to putting ourselves first, and it requires an enormous amount of humility. You know, if you have had the benefit and the privilege of an education like I have, you know, I'm the only one in my family, first in my family to go to college, and I'm a lawyer. When I walk into a room, people are proud of me and they want to defer to me. They're like, llegó la abogada, right? And I have to be quiet. I have to listen. I have to listen with all my senses. And I have to use whatever skills and whatever, access to that privilege to be able to elevate and facilitate that community vision. I need to step back. And so all of the work requires deep humility and a recognition that there is brilliance in the room. Also, this assumption that it's people with an education that know the most and know more. My grandmother didn't know how to read or write, and my grandmother was brilliant. And so I've been in meetings with people in the community who really do know how transit is working or not working, where cancer clusters are and how close they are to emissions. They know, they have the knowledge. And so you have to respect that. And then the other part is you have to respect and honor ancestral knowledge. The truth is that for climate change, who we were is going to be the thing that's going to save us. This is a consumption addicted culture, which throws everything away. We don't know how to fix things. We don't know how to make things, and we don't know how to grow things. And our people from the global South do know how to do that. And so this is where the fact that historically we have always lived within our carbon footprint, this is where you go for solutions. And so these techno fixes are not going to work given what we know about the science of climate change. So I would ask planning students to embrace the idea that they are there to support, to elevate, to staff the community. UPRO sees itself as staffing the community.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, because I think one of the other questions we had from one of our colleagues is really amplifying the point that you just made, because the question, I think we've already addressed it, but I'll share it just so that you know and the group audience can see as well, is the question is this: can you provide some perspectives of how planning professors and students can engage effectively with communities? And you spoke to that just a minute ago, to overcome the legacy of practices that extract knowledge from communities rather than strengthening and empowering them. And so I think you spoke about humility, and I think it's also about creating a long-term trust building, and that I think takes time. So everybody's in a hurry to get their degrees and graduate and go on, and it's a challenge that we have to navigate together, I think.
But Laxmi, it's so possible. Tonight, this evening, we have about 15 students from Pratt that are coming in to meet with us. And we have had studios that have been done by professors with us. And we start by saying, This is our culture of practice. Here are the Hermes principles. We expect you to follow them. This is what we'd like from you. And then they come and they do a presentation. And then we sit down we bring the community together and we look at the presentation and we let them know where the problems are, right? And then they come back. I have to tell you, every single time they come to us, the first round, in the first semester, the first month, they come to us with things that we can't use. But by the time that they have developed a relationship with us, by the end of the semester, we're talking about complete transformation, not just for them, but for us and for what we've been able to do for our community. So I think it's even possible to happen within a semester. We've seen that happen at Uprose, and I really believe that that's possible. You know, you have to have professors. I know the politics of universities is crazy. I don't even know what that's like. And the fight for tenure and what you all do to each other, I have no clue. But I can tell you that working in a way that's interdisciplinary and exposing students, giving them an opportunity to stretch, you know, if they have a strength in one area, exposing them to something else so that they're not working in silos. And getting their marching orders from community really makes a big difference early on. But we've seen it happen, Lakshmi. Our Climate Justice Center exists because of that. And the grid, which is a comprehensive waterfront plan for our industrial waterfront, which is on our website, that is the product of all that work done with graduate students, with professors, with people who do planning work with us.
Thank you. I thank you for lifting up the process of working with students and the iterative nature of sharing knowledge and then adapting it to be useful to the challenges at hand, right? And that's a continual effort. Another questions come here, and it's also very interesting. Can you speak to how those within the field of planning can better build a movement? Planning is so siloed within its subdisciplines, it's hard to mobilize needed voices in transport, housing, finance, technology, beyond those interested in environment, land use, and social justice. How can we be good allies, but also excite others to take into account the message you have shared?
So the question is, how can we build a movement? And I would say to that, there is already a movement. How do you support and how do you staff a movement? How do you become an ally within that movement? So I think that's the question. And so we have, like, if you go to the Climate Justice Alliance website, or you go to the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance website, you will see our frameworks. You will see what our priorities are as a movement. And it's true, we need all of the disciplines and all of the expertise that you are all developing and that you already have. And so there are different ways of plugging in. You know, when we were thinking about community-owned solar cooperative, we didn't know what we were doing. We had a vision and we brought together a bunch of people and we started asking questions. And then there we were faced with, where do we get pre-development costs? Are there investments that are based on non-extractive funds? How do we do that? All kinds of questions that we didn't know. And so we put these questions together, and then we, and who are the socially conscious investors, so that we can pass on the savings and ownership to create community wealth to our community. What do those systems look like? What does governance look like? We didn't have the answers, so I don't want to pretend that we have the answers to all those questions. We are people that are led by core values and vision, and then we bring together a bunch of people who are able to make it possible for those to manifest. And in that regard, all of you have the opportunity to do that. So it's not, remember when I was speaking, I was saying that there's this rush to create new coalitions, new alliances, new, more. And all of those things need to be funded. And all of these things are competing with each other in order to exist, instead of doing some landscaping to find out what's out there, where are the gaps, and where can I plug in to support. at the end, everybody gets shine because this is a leaderful movement. And there's room for all of us, and there's a need for all of us. So I would move away from how do we create to how do we plug in, because a movement exists.
Thank you. Do you have any questions for our group? I'm just curious while we're waiting for questions to come in, and because you have 90 plus attendees here who are all planning educators from the US and around the world, and several students. So if you have any questions for us, I think that'll be interesting too.
Well, it's really interesting because in different parts of the world, people have solutions, and they look different. I wonder, as academics, as professors, what are some of your challenges given, you may have just had a very conventional education and you're trying to do something that is unconventional because climate change is unconventional, right? It is unpredictable, it's disruptive. And it lands in a lot of different ways. Like we've had tornadoes in Brooklyn, like who ever heard of that, right? It's not Kansas. So what are some of the challenges as people who are in academia that you're having in terms of, if you invite someone like me to speak, it means that there's something about how the work that I'm doing and the work that we're doing in the movement that you think has value in terms of how we're moving forward in the future. And I think that that's important to you. So what are the challenges you're faced with in terms of integrating these values, integrating this process, and the kind of just relationships that we need so that we can start creating the kind of future that we envision?
I'm sure my colleagues will be happy to put their remarks in the chat, but I can answer as one planning professor. Since I post the question to you, I'll respond. I think the challenge is helping our students create the balance between the technical knowledge that is needed to be supportive and useful, like you were saying, like, how do I actually compute something, or how do I get the data on what are the best practices elsewhere so that I can share them with the group, like, so some technical work to balance that technical with all those skills that are so essential, being humble, being collaborative, being the ability to listen, and be patient that things are not solved right away. And we often struggle with how to balance that, of how much of one to do the other in the limited time that we have with our student. And we have students coming to us with diverse backgrounds and diverse interests. And so the comment, right? Like you enter the conversation from one place, like housing or transportation, but how do you take an integrated view? And I think that's something that we struggle with. And there's a question that came up while we were talking, is how do you navigate meeting immediate community needs with long-term strategizing and planning? So that's that's also something we try to teach our students, but it's a challenge.
Well, it's interesting because the students in the past have created for us short and long-term goals and short and long-term money for those goals. So they have said, okay, this is what you could do within 6 months. This is what you could do within a year. These are the resources you need to do this. That's the other thing, is that often young people fundraising and how to access those resources, even on a federal level, is a mystery. Is a mystery. So they could be leading with vision and have these ideas about infrastructure projects, but they don't know how they're going to get it funded. It just sort of remains an idea. In terms of how academics are not communicating with each other, context is important. And even to talk about transportation without context makes no sense to us. We had in Brooklyn a proposal for $2.5 billion streetcar that would have displaced small businesses and local residents and would have gone through a storm surge zone at 11 miles per hour. And we were telling the mayor, it's going through a storm surge zone and we need mass surface transit. We don't even know if subways are going to continue. And I know it hurts New Yorkers and I'm a New Yorker, but we don't even know if they're going to be able to withstand recurrent extreme weather events. They were not built for that and it's cost prohibitive. So we're going to have to be thinking about social cohesion. If we are building it upstate, those are jobs for economically depressed communities upstate New York, but they will benefit the city of New York by buying more mass surface transit. Investing in in transportation amenities in communities that are up and coming, and not finding the resources for communities that have been transit deserts. That's how you have to bake in equity, and you have to bake in racial justice into all of the planning and all the decision making. So I've never understood how you can talk about one thing without talking about the other, but that's your challenge, I think.
More questions coming in. What is giving you the most hope right now?
I think the thing that's giving me the most hope is that we have done what people never expected from us. People have deficit-based expectations of people of color, and they also determine the success of an organization by the size of the budget and not the size of the impact. And what's happening on a national scale is that you are seeing a shift towards centering racial justice and equity and frontline-led solutions, not only in infrastructure, not only in policy, you're also seeing it in funding. You're seeing it in decision-making. And I think people know on some level that think about the shifting demographics in the United States, and by the fact that by 2042 we become the majority in this country. We become the majority when climate change has had a full toehold in the United States, and communities that have had to deal with a legacy of environmental racism are going to be just torn apart by the changes that are heading our way. And so I think that on some level, maybe spiritual or emotional, people know that it's time for change, and that what has gotten us here can't continue, that the legacy of extraction in all its forms has got to stop, and that building with each other and building just relationships is better than the competition that has basically torn us apart. It is scary, and that's why I opened by talking about habits. Because habits are hard to break, and we've been conditioned to think and be with each other a particular way. But I really do believe that that's what climate change is demanding of us. And what I'm seeing, and when I say leaderful, like think back to, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all of the leaders that existed in the past. It was always one iconic leader that spoke for a movement. And what you're seeing is mostly women leading, and mostly Black, Indigenous, and women of color leading on climate justice. And we have a very different way of working with each other. We collaborate, we feed children and have our pets around and share information. We are leaderful, and we're also intergenerational. And what that means is, and you've been hearing a lot about young people leading in the climate movement, but the idea of young people leading and pushing older people out and older people holding on to power is also capitalist. The idea is that learning happens across the table and across generations, and that we need each other in order to be powerful and impactful. I'm seeing all that. Maybe I live in my own world where everyone is like that, but it's hard to think about. It's hard to think about the Green New Deal, about the Thrive Act, with the CLCPA, and all of the national legislation that is out there without knowing that our fingerprints are all over it. So I'm seeing transformation that I've never seen before, and that's really exciting.
Thank you. I think you just alluded to this, but this is the question. How are you building a feminist racial and climate justice movement? And I think more example or context would be helpful.
So my organization is made up of women of color, Black, Indigenous, and women of color. We are centered in a feminist economy, and we get our principles and our marching orders from the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and we have learning circles on gender justice on a regular basis. We're intergenerational. We have young people on our staff and on our board. Young people literally grow up in the organization and into leadership. We've held 8 climate justice youth summits, the largest gatherings of young people of color on climate change in the country. We've sent 4 young people to Antarctica and 3 to the North Pole on scientific expeditions, because we believe that young people of color are not at risk, that they're at potential, because we were them once, right? And we know that if there's anybody who is going to be impacted the most by extreme weather events, it's going to be women and children. And so women have to lead, and women have solutions think about what women do on a daily basis. So all our work is centered on that. But I also want to say, as the mother of a son, the sister of 5 brothers, the wife of a husband, that it is impossible for us to expect for our young men to understand patriarchy if we don't provide them with that guidance and that support and that education. That we have a lot of programs for our girls, and we celebrate and lift our girls, but we don't talk to our boys. We sort of expect our boys to be in the world where they are being bombarded with models of leadership and power that are extractive and patriarchal, and we don't give them an alternative vision or an opportunity to be in a space where they can be full human beings and know that power is shared and that resources are shared and that is power. We don't do that. And then we chastise our boys when we never took a moment to take them out of that extractive patriarchal space and provide them with that guidance and that support and those learnings. So I think we have to pay attention to our boys, and that men who want to be non-patriarchal and support women in leadership have to challenge men who are patriarchal and exclusionary, just like people who believe in anti-racism have to take on folks for us. So I think that's our responsibility if we're trying to build just relationships with each other and engage in self-transformation. But I did want to mention boys, because at Uprose, for some reason, we have a lot of boys that join Uprose when the leadership is all women, and they literally sit with you and say things to you like, I think I'm being patriarchal. When a 14-year-old comes over to you and says, I think I'm being patriarchal, you can't help but smile, because that person has done some self-assessment and has determined that maybe they're contributing to the problem and they want to learn how to be a very different kind of human being. We need to be able to be intentional about creating those spaces as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Elizabeth. Boy, the questions just keep coming. This is, I believe, a student question. What kinds of local state collaborational efforts have been made to lower the possible job placement burdens of lower income neighborhoods from electrification? Example, one suggested transition to a cleaner production.
That's a very, very, very specific question. What I can tell you is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is now looking at different sectors, including electrification. It's looking at the number of jobs. It's looking at what are the skills that people have in the community. So if you create the jobs, who benefits from them? How traditional workforce development, people serving those needs, do they need a different kind of training and orientation? What are the gaps in terms of skill sets to address that sector and other sectors like, offshore wind? What are the skills that are necessary? What are the accreditations? How do we start preparing the workforce for green jobs? And that's not just the electrification sector, that's all of the different sectors. If we don't do that, and then our communities won't be ready to access those opportunities. So I think that those are conversations that are being had on the local level. New York Renews is a statewide coalition with close to 300 members throughout the state of New York. There are a lot of state coalitions all over the country that are being modeled after New York Renews. And I would advise that you go to their website and check it out, because I think you'll find a lot of information that will be useful, because we've got people that are thinking about all those questions.
This is a question from a colleague outside the US. How do you deal with cases where short-term problem-solving solutions that address immediate issues, dire issues, lock in undesirable long-term trajectories?
That is one of the reasons why we fight false solutions and tech fixes, because this is a Band-Aid to the climate crisis that is going to have a long-term impacts on our communities. It's something that we're debating with Gina McCarthy and people that have been appointed by the Biden administration, because they're saying that the IPCC, I can never say that, but you know what I mean, the International Panel on Climate Change is saying that the need is so dire that they need to invest in these techno fixes. So it's exactly that. And I think we've got our response to that. If you follow the Climate Justice Alliance on Twitter, you'll see multi-part responses to specifically that question. We're seeing it happen in like Africa, where corporations like Exxon and these multinational corporations that have been responsible for the contamination of the River Niger and the soil and the water, and contributed to health disparities and economic displacement in those communities, now want to bring in false solutions and give people money so that they could, and say that they're helping the local community by putting money in their pockets. To us, it feels like the trinkets that were given to us before we were colonized and invaded. It's literally, not only did we destroy your ecosystem and make it impossible for you to thrive economically and destroy your health, but now we're going to take some more out. We're going to commodify these things and extract your community and turn it into sacrifice zones. And those are just real quick solutions that literally ride on fear, right? Because people are afraid of climate change, and make it seem like we are impractical, like we're not honoring the science, that somehow we're not working with scientists or engineers or the people who actually know how to test these solutions that are being recommended. And that's the farthest thing from the truth. It's just a way that corporations are trying to marginalize what is a response from the front lines of the climate crisis. But that, what you've raised, is happening all over the country. And there's an enormous amount of funding invested in that. And so what we are trying to do is line up all of our scientists to respond to whether or not these are untested recommendations, and what the implications are long-term. So, you know, the idea of sequestration, the fact that you can actually inject pollution into the soil and have generations from now actually discover that is just so irresponsible. It's just an example of again, a culture of practice that got us to where we are.
Well, I'm going to use moderator privilege and ask you one last question, if I can. And the last question is really to ask how your work directs investments into affected communities while holding off gentrification and real estate speculation pressure, because it's
that's the hard one. So I'll be honest, when we started winning environmental justice campaigns, we stopped the siting of a power plant, we doubled the amount of open space, we made the air cleaner, we had all these victories, right? All of a sudden developers were using the environmental amenities and our victories to engage in speculation and to displace us. One of the big fights that we had was against Industry City. Industry City We're talking about $1 billion corporation tied to Amazon wanting 5 public relations firms. And then there's us, right? It's like David and 3 Goliaths, right? Putting out a rezoning that would have taken the industrial sector. Remember, this is an industrial working class community. So even though the peaker plants and the infrastructure and the companies on the waterfront have been killing us for years, it made it possible for this to continue to be a working class neighborhood. It protected the culture, the character of the community as a working class community. So here comes Industry City and sees opportunity. And so sees opportunity where we're seeing, looking at the industrial sector as a vehicle for green jobs and a vehicle for climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, right? And so that was a fight. We were actually asked, we were in the middle of doing this block to block organizing. And we were so excited about that when the community came to us and said, we need you to fight this anti-displacement fight. And we were like, oh, we don't do anti-displacement work. You know, we're the climate justice activists. And we were told, this is a fight connected to what you want to do with climate change. And we saw that. And so for seven years, we fought a company that dropped tons of money into the pockets of other community-based organizations whose mission was to serve the community, tons of money into churches, try to create confusion in the community, say that we were anti-job, and we would say we're pro-green job, we're not anti-job, had unions step up to us. I remember being menaced and threatened, physically threatened by 32BJ, where workers put their hands in my face and saying, we want jobs. And we were like, no, well, we want green jobs. It was a fight for the future of the industrial waterfront, because if Industry City won, what we would see would be high tech offices, avocado sandwiches as if they invented them, right? And what we would see would be the ripple effect of that kind of displacement in the community. We needed to engage in industrial retention, and we needed to have a vision that would be a different kind of industrial retention. And that was a huge 7-year anti-displacement fight. It looks different in different places. If you go to Puerto Rico, where the entire island is being privatized because people speculate and take advantage of disaster and literally pimp people's pain, right? And Puerto Rico, of course, is a colony of the United States. I don't know how they're going to be able to push back against the onslaught of displacement and privatization and deep colonization that is taking place in Puerto Rico. But in Brooklyn, you know, we worked with planners and we figured it out. It took us 7 years to win that fight. It was also a big political fight because we, remember, had we not been part of a movement, I don't know whether we would have won. We were able, they reached out to all their friends on a national level, right? We reached out to all of our friends on a national level. And then we organized, we disrupted, we literally walked into their spaces and disrupted. We had a banner drop at the People's Climate March. We had a banner drop that was like 4 stories high about protect our working waterfront. So the fight against displacement is enormous. And I know that we're one of the few groups that has been able to win a victory like that one, but it took 6-7 years of our lives. And to be honest, there were moments that I was just like in the middle of the night telling my mom, I can't lose, you know, we can't lose this thing. And she was like, oh, you know, God's looking out, the ancestors are looking out, walk with the ancestors, you know, the things that our mamas tell us, right? But yeah, that was deep organizing combined with understanding policy, with having political leverage. It was a variety of things, knowing how to use comms, knowing how to use social media to message and to push back. It was a very complex and sophisticated campaign, but it is hard. It is hard. It's almost like we're being told that, yeah, you have endured a legacy of environmental racism, and now that you're cleaning up the neighborhood, you can't live here anymore. That's the message that is being sent to our communities. So it is hard. I won't pretend that it wasn't hard. and that if we're faced with it again, I don't know, we will do the best that we can.
Elizabeth, we have come to the end of a very, deep emotional hour of conversation with you. And we are so grateful that you took the time to speak with us today. Our planners are really committed to climate action. We have a climate action task force. Many of the members of our task force are here in the audience today and have been asking some of the questions to help amplify your message further. We are committed to the climate work and we seek your support. And please also call on us if you need us, as you are connecting with local planners. Please also connect with others as needed. And again, thank you so very much for being with us today. And we apologize for the technology issues in the beginning, but we're good. And so again, everybody put your messages in the chat and give your best to Elizabeth, and we will bid adieu in a minute. Thank you.
Gracias de corazón. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.